Hi everyone, welcome to my paper, Children of the Atom, Youth, Crime and Justice in Marvel Comics. Many of you watching this today are probably thinking how superhero narratives fit into this subject. With a focus on disability, crime and youth and deviance, this paper opens up the X-Men stories to offer a discussion of that and bring X-Men to a wider audience. And it further questions who we mean by youth, since childhood innocence and youth are as much a social invention as crime is. Uh, Before I start, I thought I would also talk a bit about some of the other work I've done, bringing social science into popular culture. This paper is one among others that I've done, extrapolating metaphors of oppression and privilege from Marvel texts, including Jessica Jones and Black Panther. A previous paper in the bottom right-hand corner there called What's Theory Got to Do with It? The Silly Archives, Film and TV, and Popular Trash as Cultural Revolution. Um, Use Marvel texts like Shang-Chi, Avengers, Age of Ultron, and Captain America, the Winter Soldier to talk through well-known theories like post-colonialism and mass surveillance in popular places. Honey, I Shrunk Racism, um, Honey, I Shrunk Racism, Whiteness, and the Subatomic Dimension in the top left-hand corner there is a paper I did for Kingston University's Writing Cultures group. It was the beginning of a new work that uses the specific law in Marvel media to create extended metaphors for the ways microaggressions behave in our bodies and minds. I came to use art as a way to feed my brain that I struggled to understand to feed my brain the ideas that I struggle to understand when written in many traditional academic contexts, like journals, for example. Here I came to literary scholar Elizabeth Freeman, and where she says the humanities are the shock to common sense, the estranging move that will always make what we do unintelligible and incalculable, and that we may realize or catalyze enough energy to blow out a few institutional fuses. Post 2020, many friends and colleagues working in anti-racism spaces, both in academia and outside of it, were talking to me about how the term microaggression, first coined in a post-civil rights era by Black psychiatrist Jester Pierce, in the present day, now minimizes their impact. I began to think a lot, and eventually brought myself to the term subatomic racism, which is effectively the love child of traditional race scholarship and quantum mechanics. The latter, a physics subdiscipline that Stephen Hawking wrote as stunning phenomena on extremely small scales, such as a millionth of an inch. I used the world of Ant-Man, not directly quantum mechanics, to get there. In the Ant-Man mythology, subatomic realities are where concepts of time and space become effectively meaningless. Then also coming to Charles Mills's term, racial time, was useful here, along with Frantz Fanon's prior link between mental illness and colonial terrorism. I did another paper, which I'll link here in the video, um, called "The Wretched of the Multiverse," using texts like Doctor Strange and Ms. Marvel to give the mental image for racial microaggressions as colonial terror at home, necessitated by mental illness. Anyhow, this use of comics and heroes or hero narratives and the worlds that sit within them is something I regularly use to make sense of of real discrimination and violence. So the thinking behind this paper, comic narratives as vehicles for understanding different ideas, is not new at all. Elizabeth Freeman follows Lauren Ballant's counter politics of the silly object, which was also predated by Stuart Hall's work, and he believed popular culture as a site of struggle between the powerful and the rest of society. He believed cultural texts were a double movement of containment and resistance, um, and reflective of dreams and aspirations, and also more critically, evidence of a relationship between the public and dominant power relations, like how the upper echelons of the establishment influence what popular cultural texts get produced. In 2011, um, academic Jack Halberstam wrote, uh, "The silly archive allows me to make claims for alternatives that are markedly different from the claims that are made in relation to high cultural archives. The texts that I prefer here do not make us better people or liberate us from the culture industry, but they might offer strange and anti-capitalist logics of being and acting and low theory knowing, and they will harbour covert and overt queer worlds. I believe in low theory in popular places, in the small, the inconsequential, the anti-monumental, the micro, the irrelevant." Who Stan Lee and Jack Kirby presented as the mutants in the X-Men comics from the earliest days of the 60s came to commentate on state and institutional violence, prejudice, discrimination, exclusion, and also belonging, a group of fictional characters granted powers through genetic mutation, the X gene. In ways, this fits well into debates of autism not being a superpower, although it's something like the X gene that people like myself have inherited and have inherited through family members and so on. And if we too have children, might also pass it on, because autism is genetic. So after the war, the US in the 1960s was a time when popular culture illustrated new ideas of racial and gender injustice in that generation of free love and also civil rights. Essentially, the adventures of the X-Men are about a group looking for belonging in a world that does not love them back. One of those mutants is Professor Charles Xavier. His school from the earliest X-Men comics is a metaphor for how possibly disabled and also otherwise neurodivergent people find spaces and places to manage their neurotypes away from neurotypical and or abled prejudice and ableism, like the criminalization that goes on in schools and also the criminal justice system in the human mainstream. In the Uncanny X-Men issue 1, we are introduced to that school. Further to the 2011 film X-Men First Class, which takes place in the early 60s during an alternative history of the Cold War, where Charles Xavier, along with his first class of mutants, help in preventing the Cuban Missile Crisis. At that point, Charles Xavier is around 30 years old, mentoring his younger students who are, I think, a few of them might be teenagers or in their early 20s. One scene early on in the film shows a metaphor for how their mutations, how some mutations are seen as more acceptable than others. In one scene, he's flirting with a woman in a bar. She has blue and green eyes, so one green and one blue. Heterochromia is an accepted form of mutation that at one point may have been seen as a disability at some point in history, much in the same way like wearing glasses. And it's a disability. It's like wearing glasses. It's poor eyesight has been accommodated for through policy making, and so on. It's something human society has come to normalize, while the mutations characters like the X-Men carry are seen as human invitations for prejudice, violence, and discrimination. Howard Becker's book Outsiders is useful for this world where the X-Men are viewed as criminals by society, even when they are too catching criminals. Police do not like their idea of vigilante justice, thus label them as wild and out of control. Yet these ideas of deviance are not always clear when there are groups of so-called bad mutants who use their powers for their own self-interest, notably characters like Magneto, who advocates for mutant supremacy. Yet groups like the Morlocks that dwell in the sewers of New York City, first appearing in the Uncanny X-Men issue 170 in 1983, are excluded by humans and also other mutants. The Morlocks were first presented as a society of outcast mutants who could not pass as human as many of the X-Men do. Individuals, mainstream society, human and mutant did not fully accept, judged based on how they looked and lived. Comparatively to our real world view, these characters could be coded as both homeless and disabled, who cannot, for lack of a better term, hide their disabilities. This places the Morlocks into being multiply minoritized and also disliked by people of the same group as them. Many ended up acting criminally because it is what society expects, almost like a self-fulfilling prophecy. What society expects, including members of the X-Men. The Morlocks colour outside codes of acceptableness, where homelessness also colours outside lines set by the state and ends up being targeted by the police and the public alike. The Morlocks are targets of conflict, which comes back to how autistic people too, and also other disabled people, come to be targets when we exhibit behaviours like overwhelm, which are often misconstrued or construed as violent by groups like the police, as an example. When we talk about youth as well, I think more to experience rather than age. Most mutants arrive at Charles Xavier's school in need of help, and many adult characters end up being students. And I think of youth as a point of naivety, in need of learning and being teachable of some sort of life lesson. Most X-Men never move beyond that, and in some ways, a lot of these adult characters never fully grow up. If we see how childhood innocence is socially invented, the ways traditional rites of passage, milestones, or coming of age markers are shifting cannot be surprising, especially in a world of capitalism too. Bronfenbrenner's ecological model of human development looks at four things that influence a young person's identity: family, colleagues/school, community, and the media. All points of contention in the X-Men comics, where mutants are viewed as criminals by family and media, whilst they also struggle in school environments, prejudiced by teachers and school staff alike. Youth as as wide-ranging as people in need of help, reaching enlightenment. Mutants come to be excluded, shunned, and discriminated against. The 1981 storyline, Days of Futures Past, begins with the knowledge that many of the leading X-Men had been killed by state experiments in pursuit of a world without mutants. Eerily, like former UK PM Boris Johnson saying, "Let the bodies pile high," in reply to criticism of his herd immunity plan to beat COVID in 2020 and 2021. Days of Futures Past offers a dystopian future where mutants are hunted by state-financed mutant-killing robots, the Sentinels. A strong allegory for the Holocaust, notably to mass killings of disabled people and other groups, but specifically here where nursing homes, special schools, and mental hospitals became magnets for the Nazis. The term autism wasn't actually introduced into the Western world until 1911 by Swiss psychiatrist Eugene Bleuler, and he used it to describe schizophrenic patients who appeared disconnected from reality, as Edith Schaeffer discusses in her book Asperger's Children: The Origins of Autism in Nazi Vienna. The term Asperger's, that gained popularity in, I guess, the 70s and 80s, was named after wartime physician Hans Asperger, which has since been discarded by swathes of autistic people, especially activists, because of his connections with the Nazis. While he was not a member of the Nazi Party explicitly, he was sympathetic. Historian Edith Schaeffer writes about this further and how his actions at the Spiegelgrund facility led to the deaths of numerous children. He publicly encouraged his colleagues to transfer difficult cases to Spiegelgrund, and he followed suit. In 1942, Asperger was the creative education consultant on a seven-member commission for Vienna that assessed the educability of children at Gugging Care Facility. They deemed 35 of 210 children incapable of educational and development engagement. These youths were sent to Spiegelgrund. All of the 35 transferred by Asperger's commission died. Gugging was a major feeder for Spiegelgrund. Of the 136 children removed to Spiegelgrund during the war, 98 perished, mortality rate of 72%, and meant that 1 in 8 children of the 789 known to have died at Spiegelgrund came from Gugging and can be traced back to the action and Asperger in that sense as well. Days of Futures Past takes place in a dystopian future, much to a similar effect, when mutants were experimented on, discarded, killed. The US Holocaust Memorial Museum also estimates around a quarter of a million disabled people were killed in the Nazi euthanasia program. The X-Men comics show how fiction commentates on some of the worst crimes in human history, taking us up to the gates of concentration camps like Auschwitz, metaphorically through a Marvel story. Back in 2020, a £3 million Cambridge UCLA research project called Spectrum 10K announced they would use the DNA of 10,000 autistic people for alleged wellness purposes. It was designed to show how biology or biological factors and environment impact autistic well-being. At the time, they said Spectrum 10K would not look for so-called autism cures and does not aim to eradicate autism. But disabled activists were concerned how the research could be used in the future. Activists organized and then boycotted under the campaign #boycott Spectrum 10K. In the context of youth, crime and justice, I'll be really thinking about the ways such research could be used in school SEN provisions and special educational needs. That's not an ideal term either, where many autistic children are in pupil referral units. Many autistic activists were concerned with the involvement of high-profile academics who had previously pushed stereotypes like autistic people lacking empathy. Additionally, the involvement of scholars who were known for their support for autism cures and their affiliation with organizations like so-called Cure Autism Now, not unlike the 2004 X-Men Gifted storyline, written by Joss Whedon and illustrated by John Cassidy about the politically motivated mutant cures. In 2025, Gifted speaks to the debates about autism cures that peaked in 2022. In Gifted, Joss Whedon introduced a mutant cure designed by a scientist called Dr. Kavita Rao. This idea of a cure for mutants brings the logic of eugenics back into the present, on adults, on children, on young people, and the injustice that comes with that. However, not everybody is impacted by their autism equally, which makes talk of cures in autism spaces and in broader disability justice spaces a touchy subject, to say the least. One article for organisation Neuroclastic, which I'll link in the description, states that some autistic people believe a miracle cure is easier to imagine than a world free from discrimination. Like the X-Men conversation of over-policing, criminality, and deviance, autistic and otherwise disabled youth face that level of hostility in the face of institutional violence and state violence as well. We thus become so-called undesirables, notoriously disliked for many different reasons, a lot of it tied to autistic traits that we can't control. This metaphor comes to the surface in Grant Morrison's E is for Extinction, where on the mutant island of Genosha, mutants experience a genocide of half of the Earth's mutant population. So, in conclusion, this paper hoped to have illuminated a bit of a mix of the discussion on the X-Men, youth, crime or criminalization, injustice, and deviance. It hoped to bring a comic studies lens on issues that are well known in spaces like sociology, like criminology, like criminal justice studies, like victimology, and so on. X-Men's metaphors are useful where different plots play up those differences. It queers popular definitions of crime, youth, and justice, where vigilantism seems to be helpful, where private and public institutions cannot be trusted to help the oppressed. Charles Xavier's School for the Gifted shows how crime affects children and young people, not targeted for being young necessarily, but targeted for being mutants and having the wrong DNA, like for example, us autistics. The mutants are unallowed childhoods to. The mutants are unallowed childhoods, and are forced to grow up too quickly, as is in the language of adultification. And I wonder what an adultification lens of the X-Men would look like, where so many of these mutant children are over-policed, seen as more adult-like, and so on. This paper focused on disability more generally, and on occasion mentioned things like autism, but these metaphors are flexible enough for any oppressed group to find meaning. Thanks very much for listening. And just like any of my videos, if you've got comments and so forth, leave them in the comments, or you can send me an email at ventour.com/contact. Thanks very much.